Welcome to the Borders in Globalization podcast. Today, the main topic is the relationship between gender studies and border studies, more specifically on the North American continent. To better understand these complex relationships, we are pleased to welcome Andréanne Bissonnette, a Canadian political science researcher. Her areas of research are the access to reproductive health care, migration dynamics, and gender issues, particularly in the United States and Latin America. Andréanne Bissonnette is a postdoctoral fellow at the Border Policy Research Institute at the Western Washington University in the United States. She is also associate researcher at the University of Quebec at Montreal in the Raoul Dandurand Chair in Strategic and Diplomatic Studies in Montreal. And she's also a member of the board of directors of the Association for Borderland Studies. Welcome on board, Andréanne Bissonnette.
Hi, thanks for having me.
This podcast is divided into two parts. The first part is a general overview on gender and border studies. And the second part focuses on the relations between gender studies and border studies in the North American case study. Let's start our first part. Andréanne, we can begin with a broad question to establish the foundations of our discussion. What is the origin of gender studies and how does its evolution relate to border and borderland studies?
That's a great question and quite a large question to start us off. So I think we could spend a lot of time just on the history of gender studies, how it came to be, how it evolved, and same goes for border studies as well. But I've tried to make it a condensed history of both fields and how they relate to one another. So if the question is when gender studies became a field of studies in North America, that would be during the 1970s, initially as women's studies and later as gender studies. So during that decade, universities and colleges in the US started offering courses in women's studies, and national associations and journals were created. However, that is far from the origin of feminist thoughts. We can think, for example, of Hélène de Gouges, Christine de Pizan, or Sojourner Truth, who have all impacted feminist thoughts and theories. What is interesting when we're thinking about gender studies and border studies together, though, is how they both rose to recognition in the same decade, and both of them are inherently interdisciplinary fields. So to answer your second question, how does it relate to border and borderland studies? Well, as gender studies evolved, it came to be present in multiple fields, and we started to see gender theories in other fields such as political science, geography, sociology, anthropology, and others, where we also found researchers that were looking at borders and borderlands. How do we inhabit those spaces? How those spaces create or reinforce power dynamics? What are the sociological dynamics present in borders and borderlands? And all of those topics also have a gender component that researchers have started to also analyze through the lens of gender studies. So as border studies have also evolved, and along with it, the concept of borders has evolved. So from the sole geographical line delimiting two sovereign states, borders are now understood to be international and internal. They're visible and invisible, and they are marked by various dynamics such as border, debordering, rebordering. They are individualized and they are delocalized as well. So that makes space for more social understanding of borders, including from a gendered perspective. Additionally, the other thing I would say is that both fields, there is an openness to critical approaches and similar topics of focus, such as power dynamics, individual relations to borders, discourses, impacts of borders on communities, on daily life, etc. So we can find these areas where both disciplines actually connect quite nicely with one another. And border studies have also, in the case, for example, of the US-Mexico border, been in relation with Chicano studies and gender studies through their inception. So, for example, I think we can cite Gloria Ansaldúa and her work, Borderlands, La Frontera de New Mestiza, which is a contribution that is significant to both gender studies and border studies as it explores the border as a geographical area that is neither fully Mexico nor fully the United States, but also as invisible markers between groups, in this case, between Latinas and Latinos, and non-Latinas and non-Latinos, between men and women, and other groups. And so through her work, Ansaldúa calls on readers to challenge their conception of a border and also through a gender perspective. So I can't speak for all fields, but from a political science and geography perspective, which are more of my home fields, gender studies focus on power relations, on making visible the invisible, on gender dynamics, including from a post-colonial perspective, on bodies as territories on which states project their power, on intersectionality. All of that makes it a natural approach to address border-related issues, including the increased role of women in migration, the use of rape as a control tool reminiscent of rape as a weapon of war, power dynamics at border, how borders can contribute to maintaining or reinforcing gender power dynamics, and many more that I hope we'll have the ability to speak on more during today's episode.
Thank you very much, Andréanne, for this great overview of the interconnections between border studies and gender studies. Let us now try to understand how the gender perspective can enrich the analysis of borders, whether, as you said, they could be political, social, or cultural. How do the concepts of gender and borders intersect in the contemporary research?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I would bring us back to Cynthia Enlow's work, where she theorized that the personal is international. And what that means is that gender and women's experiences and their perspectives are central to understanding international politics. However, women have been for years and remain today in many instances invisible in international politics, of which borders are a part of. And that is whether it's in news coverage, research, or reports. And so in her work, Enlow argues that women are used as symbols, as pawns, as victims, which in turn is reflected in the research and the data that is collected. One example that I can give you of that is the use of gendered language. So terms associated with masculinity are used to describe powerful actors, whereas feminine terms are used to describe powerless actors. So if we bring this to the borders, which are spaces where sovereignty meets, where international politics meet national politics, a gender perspective can allow us for many things. One, a gender analysis of terms used to describe, talk about, or push the idea of border security or border militarization to describe migrants can allow us to further understand the symbolic associated with actors and phenomena happening at the border and beyond the border. It can help understand the discourses of political actors, how phenomena are represented in the media, in public opinion, and so much more. And the second aspect, analyzing a border issue through a gender perspective, allow for the visibilization of women, right? So if we don't take a gendered perspective, then we're all putting people within the same basket and basically saying that all of these people have the same experience of border. But as border scholars have theorized, the experience of border is highly individualized in today's world. So gender studies allow us to, as a researcher, to ask questions such as, how do women experience borders? What roles do women play in bordering processes? What role does sexuality or sexualization play in women's experiences of border? What role for female smugglers? What experiences for LGBTQ plus individuals at borders or in borderlands? So all of those topics that may be invisible through other theoretical approach become visible through gender studies approach. And lastly, using a gender perspective can allow for a larger understanding of border as spaces of power, where states project their power. And so how do borders can reinforce, for example, gender power dynamics? How do border policies replicate gender inequities? How do borders contribute to maintaining gender roles? And are there exclusion processes at borders that could be gendered in the way that they are implemented? How is masculinity promoted through border policies? How have colonial and decolonial processes at borders impacted gender realities? So from the individual experience, gender studies also allow us to have a more macro view of the border and question the processes that happen at borders, the discourses that happen at borders as well, and how borders are lived on an individual experience all the way through the policy aspect of it. Coming from political science, those are the type of questions that we are quite interested in. And as an interdisciplinary field, both border studies and gender studies, I can't summarize them as just one thing. So I wanted to give listeners a bit of examples of what gender perspectives can bring to the table, what kind of topics, the questions that they allow us to ask and answer in border studies to better understand the experiences of borders, as well as the processes that are marking borders in today's world. So to give you also a bit of maybe some examples, and I'll end my answer with that. Recent research have focused, for example, on motherhood and migration. So what does it mean to be a transnational mother, where the mother goes into a migration journey, but their children may not come at that same time? There have been also research on female smugglers, so not seeing women as solely victims of borders and migration, but also as actors of those dynamics that define today's borders, on LGBTQ plus migrants and their experiences with border processes, as well as on anti-immigration militia led by women, for example, in the Arizona desert. And lastly, on transborder activism by Indigenous women. So as listeners can see, there are various topics that can be that can be analyzed through the gender and borders concept, and see how gender may impact or be impacted by bordering processes as well.
Thank you very much, Andréanne, for this analysis. I have now a question about your doctoral dissertation. In your thesis, you mobilized the theoretical framework of feminist geopolitics centered on the territory-body-power relationships. Can you tell us the principles of this approach and give us an example, please?
Yes, absolutely. So just to backpedal a little bit to give listener a bit of context, my PhD dissertation focuses on Latinos' experiences and perceptions of access to abortion in the United States. And it builds on fieldwork conducted in 4 border states. So 2 along the Canada-US border and 2 along the US-Mexico border. And through that dissertation, I analyzed the access to abortion through geography, so where one lives, using a multi-scale perspective. So from the state down to the neighborhood where participants resided in. And the aim of my dissertation is truly to highlight the roles of borders, from the international one to the less visible ones between neighborhoods, as well as through identity markers. So ethnicity, immigration status, socioeconomic status, and education, among others. So to do so, I decided to unconventionally use a hybrid theoretical framework that built both on feminist geopolitics and intersectionality. So that allowed me to not only look at women's bodies in relation to the territory that they inhabit and as territories, but also how their experiences of power and space was dependent on those identity markers that I mentioned just a moment ago. And because I was looking at different borders, I felt that this approach allowed me to adequately capture the relations between bodies and borders, while also recognizing the specific dynamics at play in the context that I was studying. So in my case, it was the United States and its borders with both of its neighbors. So by choosing an intersectional geopolitics theory to anchor my dissertation, I was able to do two things. On one hand, test its application in relation to border regions and access to healthcare in those spaces. And on the other hand, grasp both the territory power body dynamic in relation to a geographically variable access to abortion, as well as the different power dynamics at play impacting women's bodies and their experiences and perception of access to abortion. Basically, what I did is I merged feminist geopolitics, which allowed for the inclusion of gender in interpretation of spaces, scales, and territories, with intersectionality, which defends that individuals are the product of multiple identities that intersect and evolve in different systems of domination. So feminist geopolitics calls for the inclusion of new subjects of geopolitics, including the intimate, in addition to classic scales of the global and the local. So the intimate or the body is, as well as the local and the global, are, as Mounts and Hinman put it, they are neither separate spheres nor bounded subject. Rather, they constitute places such as the border, the home, and the body. And so in doing so, what it allowed me to do is recognize the intimate as a space of production and reproduction of national and international power dynamics. So as such, bodies become simultaneously spaces of power and spaces on which power is projected, which is especially interesting when looking at reproduction and access to reproductive healthcare, right? And so people thus come to experience territory and territorialization through their bodies. And I use this approach especially because while both of them are interested in bodies and power dynamics, using intersectional geopolitics is not that common, and so it felt like the right approach for my subject. And also from a theoretical standpoint, I felt like I could bring something to the table into the literature on specialty as a space of oppression, especially relating to healthcare and borders, because there's been a growing number of publications on borders as spaces that could also produce, how can I say that? That it's not just restrictive spaces, but borders have become spaces of opportunity where you have cross-border networks of care as well. And so this all allowed me to have a deeper appreciation of how spaces are created by power dynamics and how specific spaces also produce certain identities. So simultaneously understanding space, power, and oppressions rather than viewing these three variables as unrelated to one another. So to give you the very specific case of my dissertation as the example, I applied it to the case of access to healthcare in the United States, and more specifically, access to reproductive healthcare. So through that theoretical approach, I was able to, as I mentioned, not only look at how women were experiencing their access to reproductive healthcare, but what were the borders in their daily life, how those borders may reinforce some of those experiences or perceptions, as well as how racialized and gendered bodies are being controlled by, or how the states were creating policies and projecting them onto racialized and gendered bodies, and how those experiences may vary depending on identity markers. So how Latinas experiences were different than the main literature that had already been produced on African American women's experiences and perceptions of abortion, or white women as well. So I think it's an approach that's quite interesting when looking at individual experiences and seeing how those can play on different scales from a geopolitics perspective, and how power is projected on the bodies, but at the same time, bodies are experiencing power in a specific territory.
Okay, thank you, Andréanne. I understand that the body is a deep revelator of the state's policy and the domination system, and specifically when you cross a border or in the borderland, and more specifically when you are a woman experiencing the reproductive health care establishment.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And one of the examples in the US is how healthcare system has been used also for immigration purposes. So you'll have questions about your immigration status when going to the doctor, for example, in some states. And so you see how the border is no longer just at the border, but it becomes part of healthcare access as well. It becomes part of daily life and moving around space as well. So that's kind of like what this theoretical approach allows you to do as well.
Okay, thank you, Andréanne, for these precisions. As you have said before, border areas are often spaces of conflict, domination, and increased control. But what are the main challenges that women and gender minorities face in border areas? So you give us some details, but what could you say more about that, please?
Yeah. This is a great question. And I was thinking on that question and trying to figure out how I could give you a clear answer. And I don't think I can give you a definite answer on that because, as we know in border studies, there are as many experiences of borders as there are borders and individuals crossing them, right? So it's hard to just say this is how conflict and control impact women, and that's the case for all borders, right? But I will say that if a border is site of tense conflicts, or if on the opposite, it is a peaceful demarcation between two sovereign entities, that will, of course, influence how any individual, including women, will experience the border. And so if we take only, for example, borders that are spaces of conflict or where tensions are significant, women's experiences of those borders will also depend on how gender roles are defined in each society on both sides of the border. And so I think to answer your question, I would like to delve more into one specific challenges with borders and gender, and that is the discourse that women are victims of borders, right? And a few years ago, I wrote a chapter on women's vulnerability during migration from Central America to the US-Mexico border. And the main takeaway from the chapter is that gendered experiences of borders are not a one-size-fits-all or dichotomic thing. So, for example, along the US-Mexico migration routes, one stat that is often mentioned and kind of like used to exemplify gendered violence is the shocking number of women who report sexual violence during migration, right? So numbers range from 80 to 90% of migrant women reporting sexual violence from their departure point to the US-Mexico border, including from border agent. And on that, I'll just make a quick parenthesis to suggest the listener to read Ethne Leavitt's work that delves more specifically on that topic. So from that stat, it would be quite easy to say that women in context of borders and border control are very vulnerable and are victims of their gender. And that argument could also extend to LGBTQ plus people who are often targeted on migration route. And that is true, that women are vulnerable and can be victims along migration routes and in borderlands, but that's not the full picture. And borders and migration can also be spaces of opportunities where women will gain agency, for example. And not agency from the migration project of going to a Western country, but agency from the fact that they are making a decision to migrate. And studies have shown that women will use migration to modify gender roles and gender relations, to gain financial independence, to change how they raise their children, to kind of change those gender role patterns as well. And we found also studies of women being smugglers along migration route, part of anti-immigration armed militia in the Sonora Desert, as I mentioned. They can also be actors of change through NGO work, challenge social norms, facilitate access to reproductive health, set up workshops to help LGBTQ individuals file asylum claim, as I've seen along the U.S.-Mexico border. So I think this is a very important question of the main challenges that women and gender minorities face in border areas, because too often when talking about borders and migration and conflict, we can fall victim of the vulnerability trap. And I think it's very important to recognize the violence against women along borders. It's very important for studies to delve into that topic, to highlight and to render visible the violence that women are victim of along borders, whether militarized borders, surveilled borders, or more open borders. But it's also important to not put all women into one category, or to not consider all women to be victims of border. And that's one thing that I think is quite rich about gender studies and border studies, is that it allows us, in bringing women at the center of the conversation, it allows us to have a full picture and to see those spaces where women are victims of violence, but also to see those spaces where women are actors as well of border dynamics, and are not only victims in a situation, but also have different experiences of borders, and are not only victims in those situations.
Thank you, Andréanne, for your answer. I have now a question about migration policies, and the effect of migration policies on borders, borderlands, and on different peoples. From the point of view of the effects of national migration policies, to what extent do current migration policies reproduce gender inequalities?
That is a very large question. And I think I'm going to take it from a more general terms here. So I won't pinpoint one country or the other. I won't delve too much into national context. And speaking more broadly, international dynamics. So firstly, I will say that the structures of immigration process are oftentimes, whether it's voluntarily or involuntarily by states, they are gendered. So if you think of economic migration, for example, oftentimes countries will prioritize what is called skilled migration, and which in turn will often favorize men, who are still to this day overrepresented in a handful of sectors that oftentimes fall within that category that states will identify as skilled migration. And when it comes to temporary or seasonal work visa, women will oftentimes be more so funneled into care work, so reinforcing gender roles and gender norms as well. And so, for example, on some migration route, the movement is predominantly female because of care work. However, care work is not always recognized by immigration policies, or not always adequately recognized. So that can leave migrant women in vulnerable situation with inadequate protection. And so, for example, some states, through their immigration system, they will explicitly exclude certain care work, like domestic workers, from protection otherwise offered to temporary workers. The second element I would say is that when you think of specifically asylum policies, there is no requirement for states to consider gender-based violence. So women and LGBTQ plus individuals fleeing domestic violence, gender-based violence, rape, or forced marriage, for example, will not, depending on the receiving country's policies, be considered for asylum based on the gender violence that they've experienced and suffered. And also it has been demonstrated in certain contexts that immigration officials fail to recognize the real danger of gender-based violence. So just saying, for example, to women, well, you just have to move elsewhere within your own country and that will solve the problem, right? Not understanding how endemic certain situation may be in certain countries. The other third aspect is that in multiple migration contexts, women and LGBTQ plus migrants are oftentimes more dependent on smugglers, which in turn will increase their vulnerabilities, a reality that current immigration policy don't necessarily take into consideration. The fourth element is that both during migration and in immigration detention, both women and LGBTQ plus migrants are oftentimes more at risk of experiencing gender-based violence, including rape, once also they are in the country of arrival. And I would again refer to Ethne Rubaid's work at the US-Mexico border, as well as multiple human rights groups reports that highlight the conditions of detention, including for trans migrant. And we've heard in the past few days in the United States, there have been some changes to immigration detention policies in the US towards trans migrant that will have direct impact for multiple migrants and their safety in immigration detention. And the fifth element is that immigration policies do not necessarily protect migrants' access to reproductive and sexual health care, adding another layer of violence on top of immigration detention conditions. And again, I will cite the example here of the new Trump administration, which has also, in its first administration, prevented detained minors access to abortion care in the United States. The sixth element that I will mention in regards to that question is that women are not necessarily treated equally in the face of immigration policies. Some policies will favor migration from certain countries, thus creating different classes of women, depending not only on their gender, but also their ethnicity, their religion, the language that they can speak, and so on and so forth. One element that is more specific to the Western context is that when we have policies in place, especially for asylum cases for LGBTQ plus migrants, the language that is used in those forms that people are asked to fill out are not necessarily taking into consideration the cultural differences, right? And so there has been some studies that have found that, for example, the form will ask LGBTQ plus migrants whether or not they have been to a pride parade. Well, if they come from a country that does not recognize homosexuality, they will not have been to a pride parade before, right? Because that is not something that exists. And there have been some cases as well of people questioning whether or not someone is truly an LGBTQ plus person because they have not been to those type of events, for example. And last thing that I will mention is that immigration policies for family reunification will, at time, depending on the country again and its policies, they may limit the person's ability to work for a certain period of time. So you can reunite with your family, but then you become dependent on that family, and that can create specific problematic situation, especially cases of intimate partner violence and high financial dependence from the arriving migrants towards the existing partner or family member in the country. So those are 8 elements that can give listeners an idea of how these immigration policies often reflect and perpetuate also gender inequalities. And while some countries have taken steps to reduce those inequalities and their reproduction through immigration policies, not all have, and some have also taken steps back, as I've mentioned, the case of the United States.
Thank you, Andréanne, for sharing with us these 8 elements. And it helps us to understand better the vulnerability created by border policies and borderlands policies. I would like now to speak about the concept of intersectionality. Intersectional theories highlights how social identities like gender, class, and ethnicity overlap to create certain experiences of discrimination and privilege. And my question is this one: how are intersectional theories fundamental in borders areas to understand the challenges here?
That is a very good point. And I think to go back to my previous point on intersectionality, I think this is a very crucial approach to understand the multiple oppressions that can manifest themselves or be produced and reproduced in border regions. Because all of these elements and system of oppressions and power dynamics in border region and at the border will shape how individuals will experience said borders, right?
Yeah.
So many scholars have written about borders as spaces of racial profiling and xenophobia. So intersectionality, for one, can allow us to render visible these dynamics and study these dynamics and how different groups will face harsher scrutiny or be the subject of stereotypes or be subjected to discriminatory practices such as racial profiling, longer detention, etc. And on that, I always like to give the example of when I was living along the US-Mexico border, where you have secondary checkpoints inside the United States. I would be driving my car with my Canadian plates on the car, so fully advertising that I am not a US citizen, right? And I would drive through those checkpoints, and anytime I would be behind a car, regardless of their plates that had Latinos or Latinas within the car, they would be stopped for 10, 15 minutes and questioned, whereas I would drive up with my car very clearly non-US citizen, and I would not even be asked for my passport or to prove that I am legally in the United States. So these practices, it's not just an anecdote that has been happening along the US-Mexico border, and it has been quite documented, but intersectionality can allow us to better understand those dynamics and better understand how those border policies don't have the same impacts or not experienced the same way by all individuals. And another element that is important and that intersectionality can allow us to grasp and to better understand is discrimination faced by Indigenous people. So again, for example, at the US-Mexico border, there is a lack of resources in languages other than Spanish for migrants from Central America. And that has been an increasingly significant issue in recent years, prohibiting migrants from adequately understanding the requirements or what is asked of them when submitting asylum claim. And that lack of understanding has had significant impact on the success of individuals with their asylum claims. And so some people who had a clear case of asylum were denied their asylum claim because they did not understand what was asked, or they were not able to express the violence that they were that they experienced in their country of origin. And so when you add gender to the equation, intersectionality allows you to see how being a woman or being a transgender can lead to additional discrimination and exposure to violence during migration, at the border, in immigration detention, after being released from detention, etc. And as I mentioned previously in my examples for LGBTQ plus migrant, this can also be asylum claims met with skepticism, questions that do not apply to their cultural context. And all in all, intersectionality clearly offers us a fundamental approach to better understand how racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, and other systems of oppression can shape and influence people's experiences and perceptions of the border, not just migrant, but also leisure travelers, students, visa holder, regular cross-border folks, or people residing in borderlands that are oftentimes the subject of more surveillance. So as an approach, I would say that I think it allows us for a more nuanced understanding of people's experiences with borders while addressing overlapping system of oppression, and also a better understanding and visibility of various experiences of borders and immigration policies. And sorry, the last thing that I would say is that one thing that I personally really like and really value in the use of an intersectional approach to border studies is that intersectionality prioritizes the voices and experiences of marginalized communities. And oftentimes research using an intersectional approach will use qualitative methods and will center the voices of those experiences of the borders at the center of their work. And on that, I will give the example of there is this book coming out or that just came out that's called Frontera Madrehood, and it's published at the University of Arizona Press by Cynthia Bejarano, and I'm and a co-author that I'm really sorry I'm forgetting the name right now, but they basically wrote a book that is a collaboration between a researcher and also women experiences of the border. And those women wrote their own chapter and they wrote in their own words what it was to experience the border. And I think that's quite powerful.
Thank you very much, Andréanne, for sharing your thoughts on the importance of the lens of intersectionality. In this podcast, we have understood better that gender and border studies provide valuable insights into how power operates in border regions and the consequences directly on different people's lives and bodies. But my question is this one. How can gender and border studies contribute to more inclusive public policies connected to the borders policy in general?
It's a great question. I think there are three things that can impact or can positively impact public policy. So the first thing is that border studies, by conducting fact-based research in border dynamics, on migration, on border security, can offer significant contributions at a time where borders are the focus of many political discourses. And I think it's important to go back to the facts and go back to how people are experiencing borders and what are those experiences and how those policies impact those individuals, right? Mm-hmm. And the second element is that gender studies on their end have, since their inception, allowed for the visibilization of phenomena that are otherwise invisible. And so research in that field continue to offer policymakers material that could inform inclusive public policies on a variety of topics relating to the borders. So, for example, immigration, healthcare, labor practices, etc. And so when you bring them together, gender and border studies can inform decision-making when it comes to policies that could reproduce gender oppression. So I've mentioned it, but having a better understanding of the asylum guidelines, for example, and how those are experienced by LGBTQ plus asylum seekers, well, we can ask the question of, is it the best way to ask the question? Is this going to get us to the point where we want to get in protecting an individual? Are we getting the answer that, are we getting the best answer that we could get, for example? Also, because they bring awareness to the condition and the realities of migrant women, research in gender studies and border studies can also inform policymakers about, when women arrive at the border, are current policies adequate to protect them from gender-based discrimination? Are we reproducing gender-based discrimination at the border through the forms, through how immigration detention works, through the policies that are applied at the border? So I think the value of the research is there. Research is being done in gender studies and border studies, but the main difficulty that to me remains is, how do we disseminate the research result? And if we're talking about policymaking, how should the results of those research be presented to be of value to decision maker? And what can academics do to make their results more widely available? So I think the potential of contribution is there. It's a matter of how those research make their way to Ottawa or Washington or Mexico City in North America and elsewhere.
Of course. Thank you, Andréanne. This is the last question of our first part of the podcast, and it's linked with the debates on the literature. What are the most controversial currents or debates in gender and border studies today?
It's a good question, because each of those fields have their own challenges. And so when taking them together, so gender and border studies, right, I would say that the biggest challenge when doing research in gender and border studies is that you're working with at least two fields, gender studies and border studies. And then oftentimes you may be in a university where neither of those fields are a department in and of itself. So you're adding a third discipline with your department. For example, I was in the political science department doing border research and gender research. And so I had to mix all three together. And this poses challenges when deciding on a theoretical frame, when deciding where to publish, especially as early career researchers who need publication in journals most relevant to their main field of research, right? So where do you publish if you want that paper to be of impact? So if, for myself, I'm tagged as a political scientist, I need to publish in poli-sci journal, but I'm also doing border studies and gender studies. So I also want to publish in those fields. So I think the interdisciplinarity of both fields, when bridging them together, is both an asset and one of its main challenge right now.
Thank you, Andréanne. We have reached the end of the first part of the podcast. Thank you, Andréanne Bissonnette. See you later for the second part.